And we're back to Rumblings in Remardan, my first book by Josh Golson, that's my name. And we are on Chapter 7, Explanations. Ineptius woke with that shout still lingering on his lips, but this time a damp cloth was placed in it so that he wouldn't have the opportunity to bite through his tongue. Hands tugged on his stout body to keep the dwarf from falling off the hard wooden table. Ineptius relaxed when he saw that it was his friend Matthias holding onto his arms, and then immediately scowled when he saw that it was that disgusting halfling doctor. The Herbician withdrew the wet cloth from his mouth, and the other dwarf pulled his hands away from Ineptius. Ineptius spat and looked around wildly once he sat up on the operating table. He hugged Matthias, and drew him close and said, "I'm so glad to see you." The lieutenant pushed Ineptius back a bit, to arm's length at least, and immediately ran to grab that halfling. Matthias grabbed the little man by the scruff of his outfit and lifted with that dwarven might of his. The halfling screeched for a second before it was cut off by a hearty slap from the soldier. Matthias said, "What the hell did you give him?" "I gave him something that helped. See? He's up now." The Herbician tried to shield his face unsuccessfully from the next slap that he received with a smack. "And what was it?" the lieutenant roared at the terrified humanoid. The Herbician shriveled in fear, and with a weak voice he said, "Just a mix of lilac, snake tongue, root berry, and some rum and flour to stick it all together." Matthias threw the man down to the ground with a resounding thud. "Now why the fuck would you throw all those things together? What the hell attacked him then?" The Herbician used his tiny legs and arms to crawl underneath another table. The rest of the tent was silent, with everyone watching to see how this would play out. The poor halfling took a defensive stance under that table and said, "Sir, it was probably a zognet. I thought so after seeing the way that cobbler was put under. But the description confirmed it for me." The halfling tried his best to put his clothes back in order before trying to begin regaining some of his dignity as he climbed out from underneath that table. Matthias leaned back with his arms crossed, shaking his head in disbelief. Ineptius swung his half-naked body over the side of the table where he was sitting up on and said, "So what is that?" The Herbician started to blunder in his first attempts, but finally got a grasp on his tongue. Before the halfling had found the words or the heart to speak out what he was about to say, the second sublime, Prince Casius, appeared at the tent flap. A zognet is a fearsome creature. Once it sees its prey, they are normally very eager to start feeding quickly. Those teeth you saw are used to grind up any flesh and bone into a nice soup that it can enjoy at ease. Everyone turned to the prince as he continued to talk about this creature. The eyes are so huge that it is only able to hunt at night, feasting on the unsuspecting. They are used to send its victim into a fit of pleasure that it uses to get up close to start feeding. Once that begins, the prey has no way of escaping unless it is interrupted by something, of course. Prince Casius was dressed in a regaling green and brown uniform. Those colors were so beautiful and deep, made of the most elegant dyes, that one could almost see him blending into the dirt floor of the tent itself. His pants were a mixed match of those two colors as well, with two long sashes hanging from the sides in his royal crest of a mole split in two by an axe. The dwarf wore a long, flowing black beard, and an equally long caftan in a different checkered pattern. His face was pockmarked, and his nose and mouth almost seemed too wide to fit, but he still made for an impressive elite. The second sublime himself had deigned to visit their little recovery room. Everyone could feel that this was a momentous occasion in each of their individual lives. Most people had never seen the man outside of fleeting glimpses, mere stories from his adventures to the distant and exotic lands where no one dared to speak of were spread like wildfire. People said that he was looked over by the previous king because of a misadventure that took place out there. No one really knew what the story was. Nonetheless, the soldiers serving underneath the prince continued to make up various outrageous claims to his identity, and why he was not the ruler in charge of Remardan. Some of the stories range from the banal to the absolute bizarre. There was the tale of how he simply upset his father one day by getting overly drunk at a wedding feast, and creating lewd poses with the newly married couple. Now this couple just so happened to be the highest paying Gersogs in Remardan, and so they could not afford to stand this. Others told tales that Casius had ventured out west to the Deadlands, looking for the lost remains of the glorious city of Uruk. That something had been waiting out there, something that had changed the prince, made him to become a recluse, and devote his life to study whatever it was that he had found, so that even when he was on the campaign trail, Casius still had others do the talking for him, while he sat and studied. There was no saying what had actually happened to the prince. Everyone simply knew that to see him was unheard of, and to have the dwarf himself in person was a revelatory sight that people would tell even their grandchildren about. Such a momentous occasion was marked by a dwarf who was not extravagant, though not simple in the slightest regards. The prince's whole appearance was taken in by his audience, as one of divine inspiration that one could imagine Groganus having been proud of wearing. Simple in its outward appearance, yet one could tell that there was extremely high fabrics and material gone in to make these garments, and above all, some sort of hidden strength embedded in the man himself. By the time that the second sublime had finished talking, everyone was on their knees in awe. Their eyes all shone with extreme admiration. Everyone's except for some of those halflings. They stood on their knees, like all the rest, but Ineptius noticed something else when he descended from the stretcher to bow as well. Something akin to envy, some sort of malicious hatred gleamed in those small hobbit eyes of theirs. They were beady and searching, but searching for what? Ineptius didn't know and didn't ask. He was also struck by this bearded dwarf standing at the entrance to the makeshift hospital. Casius continued while the people there were still in retrospection that they should be chosen to witness his personage. Now, come, everyone, stand up. There's no need to be dawdling when that other man could still be on his deathbed. Feed him that same intoxication that you gave to that other one, who so quickly got up as soon as I entered. Or maybe it's my mere presence that has cured you, lad. The prince smirked with a wide, impressive grin that turned the pockmarks into something of an unknown pleasure for those looking on to delight in. Ineptius bristled with embarrassment at becoming the new center of attention, as he struggled, along with the rest of them, to rise from their positions. He didn't precisely know how to respond, and no one else did for that matter, still too dumbstruck by the intimacy with which this member of the royal family had addressed them. Casius walked forward in to greet the troops and doctors who were scattered about. He started with Ineptius, going up and shaking his hand vigorously to the point where it almost hurt. The prince introduced himself by saying, really addressing both Ineptius and the crowd, I am the second sublime, Prince Casius. I know many of you have probably heard stories about me, and that's perfectly fine. I want all my men to know that they are always able to speak freely around me, and of course, out of my earshot." Ineptius changed the form of his red beard to match the ever-widening expression of joy that had crept over his face. Casius looked directly back at him and asked, "What is your name, son?" With a feeling unlike any before, Ineptius felt as though he was meeting someone straight out of the fairy tales. The long-lost legend was speaking to him in real life. He answered back happily, "I am Ineptius Securden, your highness." The dwarves parted hands and Casius had on an inexplicably quizzical face. Only for a second, that Ineptius was probably the only one to even notice. The prince quickly recovered from the slight bewilderment at hearing this dwarf's surname. "Very nice to meet someone who survived that monstrosity. I think the main reason you did so was because you invoked the name of our Lord Gorgonus. He must have saved you somehow. Your friend here must not have had the same idea as you." Casius looked over Ineptius with some sense of suspicion, and took the young dwarf from every angle. He seemed to be searching for something familiar in Ineptius. Finally, ignoring talking to anyone else, the prince said, "Come with me, lad. We're going to take a walk while it's still dark outside." Now it was Ineptius's turn to be bewildered, and he spluttered out some utterances and quickly locked step with the second sublime prince. Casius seemed to ignore everyone around them now, as he exited the tent with Ineptius, and they started wandering off into the night. They left the outer gates of the little fort that was set up for the army in town, and started to walk through the village where little lights were shining in various windows of the houses nearby. Casius withdrew a lantern when they had sufficiently gone far enough outside what could be considered regular civilization. The candle flared up inside at an incantation from the sublime. Ineptius was once again shocked that one of so much power would have even greater, and was also a wizard, or koldun. That fact was not lost on the prince. "We try to dispel people from using it by hunting them, and locking them up to be trained to serve for the greater good of all dwarven kind. Willingly or unwillingly, it matters not. I could feel something when that Zognet attacked you. Something evil is stirring in our world. Something that none of us have encountered before. Not even us wizened old Koldun will be prepared for. It might have followed me from the Deadlands. I noticed that something was stirring over there by the time I started to come back. I need you to do something for me now, Ineptius." Ineptius continued to be taken aback by these things which the sublime was so readily telling him. Another feeling was building on his skin, like ants crawling up and down his shortened spine. He was afraid of what this could mean for him and his family. Why exactly was Casius telling him these things of all people? Ineptius was simply a village boy. What the hell did this royal want with him? They looked around the clearing that they had now entered. Birch and other trees surrounded them on all sides, creating an almost charming scene of serenity built into that place. Ineptius had played at being a Reitzar many times with himself and his old friends. They even once created a makeshift fort out of branches there. The land suddenly started to turn into marshes beyond that clearing, where not many dared to venture now. There was one moment when Ineptius almost recalled something that had to do with these very same swamplands. This valley amongst the hills was quite beautiful aside from this part. The previous Gersog had tried to drain it, but as soon as the engineers came out to do the task, something always happened. One by one, the workers disappeared. Then, whatever progress they had made over the year would be demolished by the onslaught of rushing waters that would simply just wind up filling the marsh all over again. It was as if some malevolent force worked against the very will to remove the water from its territory. Some ingenious dwarves had started to set up rigging devices on little platforms in the swamp. These were used for slowly retrieving tar from it, so that they could make a little money in addition to their soldiering work. But men started to have accidents there. Ineptius thought that it had to be cursed, someplace swept aside and forgotten by Gorgonus. It was to the edges of these marshes that the second sublime had taken Ineptius. At that instant, the younger dwarf felt a strange sensation while Casius was talking to him. It was almost exactly like déjà vu. He had been to this place before. He had already been through this conversation. Why, then, was Ineptius at first so shocked to have met this member of the royal family, if they had already met? The feeling simply struck him as very odd. Some things in this world were just so strange to Ineptius. He had already been through enough in the past 2 days. Was it a day? A couple of hours? He was losing track. How was he supposed to be expecting to fulfill this ridiculous wish of Casius's? Hell, he hadn't even heard it yet. The voices in his head decided to take a break as he was invited in by the soothing softness of the prince's voice. Casius said, "I need someone in the capital with me. Someone who nobody knows. Not many people there know me by face, but there are spies everywhere. My brother is being perverted by this evil. There are rumors that he no longer holds faith in our Lord Gorgonus, the first ruler of Remardan to ever do so. I'm afraid that he may have already denounced our god." Casius took a break to catch his breath. It was cold out, and the air could be seen dissipating around where he was talking. The second sublime made hard eye contact with Ineptius. After looking him over once again, something struggled to come out of his mouth. Casius grimaced as he said, "I'm not too much of a believer, Ineptius, but I figure we should look for signs in anything, and that's why I've chosen you for this task. No one would suspect that a serf would be a part of anything, especially not one from the countryside, and especially not a dwarf serf. Trouble is brewing in the mountains, and trouble with my brother. That's why we're here only to conscript men and dwarves for the army. I can't deal with them both at the same time." He looked ever closer into Ineptius' soul as he continued on speaking. "But here you drop into the picture. You've already had a run-in with one of these things, and survived it to boot. I don't know how you did it, but obviously, you're a man of faith, right?" Ineptius was taken out of just relaxing to on edge with that question. Was he a man of faith? Well, of course he was, Ineptius thought. Always listening to sermons about Gorgonus and his heroics, admiring the way that dwarf had gone through torment and came out victorious. But any child can idealize someone for such simplistic reasons. And most adults as well can do this even. Ineptius considered himself a good person, and someone of faith. Ineptius on the whole was glad to be even given this opportunity, to get out of the village where he grew up. He was too used to the rhythmic monotony of daily life. Too many drunks wandering around the village. Too many people who were seemingly always faithful to one another. Though he could not remove the doubt in his mind that they could be seeing other people on account of how seemingly easy it was for him to do it in the relationships that he had. Ineptius appeared to be the man about town. He seemed to have long-term girlfriends. All the while seeing other women with these girls never knowing about one another. He seemed to always successfully juggle women. Though he took responsibility for every one of them, he felt a strong sense of duty towards each. In his own twisted world view, Ineptius saw each of these relationships as his sole duty to continue upholding their respect for them. He was always doing his best to impress each one in different ways, and even he delighted in seeing their smiles at the jolly and often goofy things which he did for them. These girls, of course, had no idea about one another. He had no intention of making it known to them that there were multiple women who cherished him. Each woman loved Ineptius in their own individual ways. And so, was Ineptius a man of faith? Gorgonus was not proud about the things he did, while Ineptius sometimes was. It was at the moments where he played poker with his friends, Matthias, Marcellus, Samius, and even sometimes Brentus, where he would talk about all these things. Of course, they would chide him for it, but there was some sort of revelatory magic that came when their inevitable smiles and laughter would join him in the telling of his fantastical stories of the women he'd had. Ineptius thought on all this for a few moments until siding with one of the most tempting offers made in his short life. He raised his head reluctantly before signing himself with the axe and saying, "Yes, I am a man of faith, Casius. What would you have of me?" Casius thought for a while before placing his hand on the back of Ineptius and giving him a quick slap. He smiled in the lantern light with a full toothy grin which was met by Ineptius's almost perfect teeth. "Here, take this." Several shining shekels were reflected in that light flame. The weight of the gold pressed into Ineptius's hands. It almost made his muscles struggle to hold them up. Ineptius quickly put it aside into the pouch hanging on his neck, which did nothing but transfer the strain to a thicker part of his body. Casius continued, "That should be more than enough to get you to Ostanovka, and to outfit you for your journey. I'm certain you must have a change dealer here who can break it for you. Also, take this." Casius placed into his hands a curling horn that fit snugly into the palm of Ineptius's hand. It came from Gorgonus knows what creature. It was curled all the way up to the very end, making several circles in the process. Ineptius looked at the older dwarf skeptically. It made sense that he would throw this type of money around if it was so important. It must have been very important. It was quite a bit of money. Ineptius now felt like a gersog with it straining from his neck. Casius noticed the look of greed that had sprung into the lad's eyes, and slipped another shekel dramatically into his hand to accompany the talisman. "And this is for your family." He winked at Ineptius in a brotherly fashion. "As for the horn, I killed the beast who originally wore it. Anyone who knows me, and who works for me, will recognize it should you need any help." Again, who's the gersog here? Let me think. Yes. It's that old bastard Honorian. Ineptius was again flabbergasted at the ease with which the prince cursed the lord of his village. Anyone else who was caught saying these words would be stripped half naked and flogged. That extra bit there is to help your family in case Honorian notices you missing. I suppose you should have them break it down into ducats and groats, if anyone petty should come asking after you. It'll buy them some time, and maybe even convince Honorian to let them buy your freedom as well. Once you've made it to Ostanovka, we'll get official papers made for you. Just try to avoid any confrontations with the local authorities till those are in your hands." Ineptius had heard that loudly. Everyone knew what happened to runaway serfs, and it wasn't very nice, to suffice to say it. The two of them drew their jackets tighter around themselves in the frigid air of the soon-to-be morning. After you get to the capital, look for young man Naviath. You won't have a hard time finding him in the market. Otherwise, ask around a bit, and it won't take you too long. It started to grow lighter as the moon began to set for the day to rise. Ineptius still had a burning question in his heart, and he finally had the chance to ask it. Before Casius could pick up on his next thought, Ineptius interjected and asked, "But Prince, why me?" Now, it was the prince's turn to be taken aback by a comment. The second sublime furrowed his brows in seemingly utter dismay. "Huh, don't you know who your ancestor was?" Ineptius was puzzled by his question. His father never talked about his grandfather, and his grandfather before him never talked about his father. 3 generations at least was a long way to go, especially in dwarf years. No one talked about how they became serfs either. A dwarven serf was still unheard of, aside from their family. In fact, they were the only dwarven serfs in all of Remardan. The clock began to rumble in his head from gears shifting into place that had long been silent. Things slowly started to dawn and make sense as Casius kept talking, treating his question as if it was rhetorical. There was no stopping the floodgates of information that now poured out of the second sublime's mouth. He was a great dwarven seneschal from my ancestor, King Casius. Stepanus secured him, oversaw the quick response to the takeover of this northern kingdom, though no one quite remembers what else he did, or even his fall from grace. The puzzled fright that had taken place on Ineptius's face now dissipated into one of something akin to relaxed worry. Finally, the normally dormant fire of passion crept into the heart of Ineptius as he prodded forward, questioning Casius. "What the hell did he do to ensurf us then?" Ineptius demanded with a consternation that was hard to shake. "Why the fuck are we living out whatever his punishment was? If it's undeserved by us." Casius could see the dwarf was upset at this turn of events, but if anything, he could use this anger to his advantage. The gold and talisman were already in the hands of Ineptius. He was practically hooked into whatever plan Casius had for him. He took the light thrashing of words in a good-humored manner, laughing it off, and he smiled and said, "Stepanus was a great man. If it weren't for him, his quick thinking and timing of a strategist, then Remardan wouldn't even be here today. He did something that no one remembers, or Norian probably just keeps y'all here as his personal serfs for enjoyment." Think about it, Ineptius. What other Gersog owns a dwarven serf? And besides, this is a good way to gain citizenship for you and your family. This was a decent point in itself. How else was he going to get out from under the foot of a Norian, a fellow dwarf no less? The pride of redeeming his family started to soar through his heart. Finally, it was a change of pace from his usual mundane tasks. Ineptius saw a way out of the utter monotony of his life, lived growing up crops to sustain him and his family's meager living. Sure, he would miss the comforts of his home. There were women he still had to conquer in that place, but here was the perfect chance to escape into a wide world that simply awaited him to pluck at it. Ineptius considered both sides of the argument, and for once both sides in his head were in agreement. They even seemed to come together to say in unison, "Go for it, Ineptius." The dwarf was reminded of the new reality as he had stepped into by the ardent rays that now penetrated into their clearing, and the subtle cough of Casius. Then Ineptius started. "So let's walk through it one more time. Basically, I make my way to Ostanovka, Find this young man Naviath, receive all of my family papers for freedom, and help out in any way I can? Is that it? Why not just grant me freedom now? It'd make things a whole hell of a lot easier when it comes to traveling. Everything would be easier. The Sublime Second looked around concernedly. Freedom now would draw too much attention. You're the only dwarven family in Remardan to be enserfed, so everything would be amiss. Everyone would realize something had happened. Otherwise, yeah, that's about it for now. You'll receive more instructions from Naviath. Now, do I have your word, Securitan? It's getting on light now, and I have to make it back before people start to notice, start to talk. And Neptius took a second to ponder it, knelt, and said, Yes, you have my solemn word, Your Highness. Your generosity certainly knows no bounds. I will serve you well as you have shown kindness with me here, and I will serve you till the days I die. Casius shook his head a bit, as he looked around to make sure there was no one to see the two of them. He seemed unconcerned for his safety, but worried that someone might recognize him all the same. Rise, Ineptius Securitan. Your name carries enough weight with me as is. The Sublime smiled mischievously at the younger dwarf. I trust you will get this done for me. However, don't make it known who you're doing this for, or where you're going even. Make sure to keep it a secret. I'm certain your family will be more than pleasantly surprised with those shekels. Now it's time I get back before the sun fully rises. And with that, Ineptius's interview with one of the most powerful men in Remardan was over. Casius rushed back to his tent. Ineptius stood there, still shocked at what had taken place. There was now a sense distilled in his soul, for a long time, that had finally fermented into a delicious liquor drink. Ineptius's heart was floating in it, soaking up the luxurious poisons in a ramshackle pattern. He could hardly believe what had just happened. The dwarf always felt blessed by Groganus, both being extremely lucky or extremely unlucky in all of his dealings in anything. This just seemed to be too good to be true. He checked down again at the heavy weight in his palm. And indeed, it was just as he had seen before. Ineptius struggled to undo the sack around his neck, and found it to be gleaming with golden shekels. It happened just as he thought it had. Ineptius had just accepted the hardest task that was presented before him in his, so far, short lifespan. He quickly shoved the rest of his prize into that purse, and struggled hard with his neck to hold these goods up. The burn, he felt, only gladdened him the more, and reminded Ineptius that he wasn't dreaming at all. Hell, he wouldn't be surprised if the money had just disappeared all of a sudden, knowing his luck the past 2 days. The day broke in an overarching glow that tried to irradiate the ground underneath it. Ineptius was sure to miss his life there in the sleepy village of Atrodnae. But it was time he got out. His soul felt it. He was incredibly tired as he made his way through the village, up the mountain path that had first started his path to whatever this was he intended to embark on. The soldiers were already up and milling about on their patrol routes around the city. Ineptius spotted Matthias near the entrance to Hobbles' house and promptly greeted him. The air around him tingled with his hardly concealed excitement. The two dwarves looked bedraggled, but Matthias was expectant of whatever secrets Ineptius had to tell him. Matthias said in a lowered voice, barely above a hiss, Everyone's talking, Ineptius. The camp is buzzing with rumors of what you and the Sublime Prince discussed. No one saw him return, but we're sure he's in his tent. You can always tell when he's there. Anyway, what did he talk to you about? Most times when he disappears with someone, that someone doesn't exactly come back. What was it like? What was the conversation about? It seemed like you two talked all night. Ineptius didn't like lying, especially not to one of his friends. But he had gotten so used to it from always running around with those girls. I don't think he remembered a time when he wasn't lying. Plus, he was damn good at it after all that practice. Ineptius thought of something fast, and, like all good lies, there was always some truth behind it. The second Sublime Prince Casius was just talking to me about that Zognet thing. He asked me to journey to the capital to talk before the Nistrital, so that they can understand what dangers lie in the outer villages. Ineptius raised both his eyebrows high onto his squat forehead. He clearly wasn't expecting to be such a big deal that the Sublime Prince himself would take so much interest in his friend. That's some pretty big news, Ineptius. How are you planning to get there? Are you coming back with the army? Ineptius quickly picked up the question. I think I'm going to travel alone. The prince made it sound like y'all have more business to attend to here in the west. Matthias grinned subtly at his friend, who had just heard what could be life-changing news. So you're just going by yourself? I don't think I can stand for that, especially not with what's happened already. I'll ask my corporal for an assignment to go with you. Ineptius was on his way to interrupt this dwarf, but Matthias pushed through the concerned look on Ineptius's face. It seems like we're doing nothing here in this backwater of ours, so it'll be fine if they let me go for a week or so. Ineptius raised his fingers in a conciliatory gesture, but still tried to resist valiantly. I don't want you to get in trouble, Matthias. It'll be a safe road to the capital, and I'll be able to deal with any problems. Besides, this is your first posting after all. No need to change your fortune to take a trip back to where you just were. It'd be great if you were able to join me, but I don't think they'll just let you go so easily. The lieutenant took a second to think it over, rolling it around on his tongue. Finally, he asked, Can you even fight, Ineptius? The dwarf in question gesticulated wildly, saying, Of course I can fight. I might not be all trained in the army ways like you are, but I've done my deal of hoeing. They both smiled knowingly and started to laugh, eventually wiping the tears from their eyes. The sun was on a steady trajectory upwards towards turning the day into a crisp morning. Ineptius broke off first, patting his childhood friend on the back as they looked over the hard-built fortifications against from the outside. They were impressive in the ability to keep out intruders, as the makeshift ramparts were staffed full of guards. A procession of soldiers with some riding zaiks even led their way out of the makeshift gatehouse. Matthias sighed in wonder. Frightening beasts, aren't they? I'll never understand how they're able to tame them. Just look at those mandibles. They'll chop a man's head clean off. Luckily, I haven't seen that in person yet. It'll be the day, though. When I do. The lieutenant smiled gruesomely as he was imagining a screaming barbarian with his head flying in the middle of that scream. The two friends sat back and watched the procession head into town again, to presumably recruit more peasants into their service. Ineptius finally had the chance to ask, Why is the army even here? It seems strange to have we gone to war? Matthias grinned disarmingly at his younger friend. As far as I know, we haven't. The first eminent prince gave a speech in the capital about rejuvenating the kingdom. He lowered his voice to a whisper. Or some horseshit like that. The capital's gotten strange since I became an officer. A lot less people believing in Groganus, and weird technology there. I'm inclined to think that way, too, now after what they were showing us. I'm starting to think there's no place for Groganus anymore myself. Eneptius's mouth had fallen agape. He couldn't believe what he was hearing from his longtime friend. Eneptius wasn't one to start a fight among friends, but he was a stubborn person. Still, those thoughts were interrupted by the loud crackling of those huge bugs' mandibles, and the lack of sleep from the night finally started to catch up to them. It was difficult to tell who had started it. Probably Eneptius, since he yawned almost all the time. After the first one, the two of them could not contain themselves any longer and broke into a fit of multiple yawns on end. That was until the overwhelming stink of dung hit the two dwarven friends, which drove them into a coughing fit. During the whole of it, Eneptius clenched his eyes together to fight off the salt that he could feel swelling there. It wasn't tears, but his tiredness was now driving that pain. Finally, the entire length of the army column had passed by, leaving a tiny dust trail in its wake from the slow marching orders that had been given to it. Eneptius now didn't care what happened to them, so long as he could hit the hay and recover from his lack of sleep. During that spasm, he had time to think over his friend's request to join him. The sublime prince had never specifically said not to have company on the trek to the capital, so long, he supposed, that the true goal of the mission remained a secret. Then he could undoubtedly bring his friend along. With no real fighting experience or training, it would be nice to have someone to watch his back on those roads. After all, the roads weren't all that safe anymore. Eneptius made up his mind in this way. Through logic, he could solve almost anything, and this was no different. The two dwarves finished up their yawning spurt when Eneptius said, "All right, Matthias, go see what you can do. It'd be a fun trip with someone else to share the road with." For now, I'm going back home for some sleep. We'll figure things out on the morrow. Grrr! A bird suddenly shouted. Meanwhile, I have to go break some money before I hit the hay. Eneptius smiled greedily as the bags underneath his eyes started to deepen, while he looked towards his friend. The older dwarven lieutenant, by a year or two, rolled his eyes, shook Eneptius' head, and said, "See you tomorrow, buddy." And that concludes Chapter 7. Explanations. And, of course, if you like this, please drop me a like, subscribe, share it to your friends. It does mean a lot to me. Especially it gives me bragging rights. I think that's really what's the most important. Anyways, until next time, I hope you enjoyed.